Hey, do you want to find out the history of WWE games? Well, before we get into the WWE games themselves, it's important to see the short evolution of wrestling games up to that point. The first one ever released was a 1983 Japanese arcade game called Tag Team Wrestling. The game is predictably very archaic by today's standards, but all the basics are here. You can kick, grapple, and even fight outside the ring. The game was fairly successful, even topping the arcade charts for that year's January and February in Japan. The following years after Tag Team Wrestling's release, wrestling games were being made exclusively in Japan. In 1985, Technos, the devs behind Tag Team Wrestling, released Mat Mania, the Pro Wrestling Network, and the difference between these two games is night and day. Look at how much cleaner and smoother everything looks. Despite that, I can't really focus on the gameplay because one of your opponents is called Insane Warrior, which is probably a misspelling of Insane Warrior. I guess his gimmick is crippling anxiety. The game was a massive success, being the third highest grossing game in the United States in 1986. The first fully licensed game would actually be Tag Team Match Muscle, as it was based on a Japanese manga called Kinnikuman. However, this licensing would not carry over to the US as the manga was not well known outside of Japan. The same would apply for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling first game, which was named after Dump Matsumoto. The game featured real women wrestlers in Japan, but when ported in the US as Pro Wrestling for the Master System, the game only featured fictitious male wrestlers. I do love the cover of the US version, however, because there's nothing that screams wrestling more than a beheading. Finally, a few months after Pro Wrestling's release, Pro Wrestling was released. No, I'm not having a stroke, but if you think having two Call of Duty Modern Warfares released within 15 years of one another was bad, wait till you see two Pro Wrestlings released within a few months of one another. Pro Wrestling for the NES was Nintendo's attempt at simulating the sport, and the results were great. The game's probably the most in-depth wrestling game we've seen up to now, featuring legally distinct Hogan, a variety of moves, and a referee that is more than a prop. This game was very well received. It was deemed as Computer Gaming World Sports Game of the Year, with a reviewer praising the game, mentioning its graphics, non-stop action, and real wrestling moves. The reviewer even went as far to say that Pro Wrestling was the only game that really understood what it was simulating. Pro Wrestling is also where the meme "A Winner Is You" originates from, which by today's standards is almost as old as the game itself. Watch the full video using the link in the description.